As the Bee Gees sang, whether you're a mother or whether you're a brother, you're staying alive. Staying alive. Wise words to remember, because anyone can be thrust into a survival scenario. Brothers, mothers, and others. Hey book readers, today I'm talking about the 10 best survival books I've ever read, and then I'm ranking them from worst to first. I've included fiction and non. Basically, any book where people have to struggle to stay alive. Oh, and if you have an extra second to spend outside of your doomsday bunker, please remember to like and subscribe. This channel's survival depends on you. Number 10 on my list is Left for Dead, My Journey Home from Everest by Beck Weathers. This book is about Beck Weathers' crazy tale of survival when a storm on Mount Everest in 1996 kills a lot of other climbers, but not him. He's left injured, hypothermic, and frostbitten. But he somehow crawls back to his camp and is airlifted to safety at an altitude where that kind of thing is nearly impossible. It's an amazing tale of survival. However, that's only a small part of the book. I mean, I get it. We need to know the before and after in order to better appreciate the scope of everything in the story, but there's so much introspection about how he acted toward his family. Basically, the long and short of it is that he's been a self-involved jerk. I appreciate the attempt to show how Weathers wanted this experience to change him, but the amount of time dedicated to his bad marriage is just way too much. And the worst part is that it's written like a back and forth between Beck and his wife, and you're the third wheel who's awkwardly sitting there as they bicker at each other. So the survival stuff is short but good, and all the personal failings we witness are just plain cringeworthy rather than eventually uplifting. Number 9 is The Narrative of Cabeza de Vaca. This is a true story that's stuck with me since middle school history class. It's a first-hand account told by Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca, who was part of a failed conquistador mission in the 1500s to settle Florida. Over 400 Spanish men set out on that original expedition hoping for riches and glory, but only 4 of them lived to tell the tale, 8 years later. And one of those survivors, of course, is the storyteller, Mr. Cabeza de Vaca. This story follows him and his dwindling list of friends as they walk from Florida to Spanish-controlled Mexico, all the while enduring kidnappings, desertions, and plenty of misadventures. What's cool is that you'll sneak a peek into life in the 1500s as the author becomes this kind of revered healer or shaman who's looked up to by a number of indigenous tribes, or so he says, because after all, it's his account, we have to take his word for it, and he's trying to sell his king on giving him titles and power, so this might not be as trustworthy as other first-hand accounts. At number 8, I have Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. Here's the most famous story on my list, but it's far from the most exciting. Robinson Crusoe winds up stranded on a deserted island where he tackles the difficult task of taking inventory of his supplies and building things. Not battling the elements or getting rescued. He's got plans to grow corn, raise goats, and organize his home. I wouldn't exactly call that a high-stakes adventure. Like I said, the story is bogged down with way too much detail that makes it boring rather than thrilling. I mean, I spent pages reading about a guy working on his DIY clothes. I get it. He has the skills to go from having nothing to having a decent life over the course of 28 years. But that's the thing, he seems to have the exact right skills that he needs in order to get by. So there's a lack of tension in the book. And for my part, overall, there was a lack of interest. Up next at number 7 is Hatchet by Gary Paulson. I read this over 20 years ago and I still think about it from time to time. It's the story of a young teen named Brian who's riding in a plane to visit his dad in Canada when the plane's pilot has a heart attack. So the pilot's obviously unable to maintain control of the plane. Brian takes over and somehow crash lands into this lake in the middle of the wilderness. And as you can probably guess from the title, the only useful thing Brian really has with him is a hatchet. Well, that and a can-do attitude, I guess. And with just those, he has to try to figure out a way to make fire, get food, and signal someone to rescue him. Surprisingly, it feels believable. It feels realistic. There's nothing too outlandish that Brian faces or no crazy actions that he has to take. It follows a logical progression, so you're kind of in lockstep with his decisions. At number 6 on my list is Lord of the Flies by William Golding. Here's another well-known classic with British schoolboys on a deserted island. At first the boys try to establish order and maintain a set of rules, but if you've ever seen kids on a playground, one inevitably starts bossing the others around until they're all just running around, throwing rocks, and yelling bad words that they've heard their mommy and daddy use. So predictably, it all goes south in Lord of the Flies. The little civilized society that Ralph and Piggy hope to create crumbles in a matter of days. Pretty soon the group splits into warring factions, the brutality grows, and the raw beast inside them is all released. And the reason this isn't higher up on my list of survival books is that the last time I read it, which was a couple of years ago, it was a more basic story than I remembered. There are still tense moments that keep you on the edge of your seat, but it didn't stoke my fires like it did when I first read it 20 years ago. Coming in at number 5 is Last of the Breed by Louis L'Amour. You want a gritty survival story from one of the best authors of Western novels ever? Here you go. Joe Mack, a half Cherokee, half American Air Force pilot, is shot down and held prisoner in the unforgiving Siberian wilderness during the Cold War. After Joe escapes, he taps into his indigenous heritage, using his tracking, hunting, and survival skills to outwit the Ruskies and try to get back to America. This book leans heavily into Joe's resilience and his cultural pride. It tests his strength, cunning, and endurance as he perseveres through this bone-chilling winter deep in the woods. It feels somewhat realistic until you kind of realize that Joe Mack is basically a superhero, almost along the lines of Robinson Crusoe, where his abilities line up perfect with what he's up against. Oh, and while he's in the forest, he falls in love with a Russian woman pretty quickly. And in a matter of weeks, he's figuring out how to evade the Russian military, escape to the USA, and bring his new boo along with him. So he's not just attempting to survive, he's attempting to thrive. At number 4, I have The Wager by David Grann. This is the story of the British ship The Wager, which wrecked off the southern coast of South America in 1740, I think, leaving all of the surviving sailors as castaways on a small island. What's really interesting about this one is not just one person or one group survived to tell the same tale. During their numerous months of being marooned near Patagonia, two different groups form, and the stories about their experiences are slightly different. So there are two things that the author uses as a basis for the book. One of those is logbook entries from the crew members, and then there are also documents about the trials that followed once the survivors returned to England. And both those two groups that I talked about have inconsistencies when they're put up next to one another's account. Gran does a terrific job of bringing the characters to life, as well as the events and the settings, as the shipwrecked sailors kind of struggle to persevere in the face of, they're going up against starvation and arguments and just insurmountable odds in general. Another cool trick this book pulls off is that it puts the reader in this position of judge and jury. You kind of get to decide for yourself who you think is responsible for the wreck, whether this mutiny was warranted, if a murder took place while they were castaways, and what consequences the remaining sailors should face. Read it and just see if you agree how it ends. Snagging the bronze medal for my survival books list is Island of the Lost by Joan Druitt. Get ready for a wild ride of survival, grit, and human spirit on the unforgiving Auckland Islands. In 1864, two shipwrecks leave two groups of men stranded on opposite ends of this bleak island near New Zealand. And they never meet one another, and their experiences were completely different. One of the groups is led by Captain Musgrave, and his crew band together, they build shelters, they ration food, and they come up with ingenious ways of staying alive. Meanwhile, in the second group, it's just total chaos. Infighting, selfishness, a lack of leadership, and a dash of cannibalism. It's really two tales in one, and they completely contrast with one another, showing just how much cooperation and resilience mean when survival's at stake. This nonfiction read is never boring. It's absolutely gripping with remarkable details about a 19th century survival story. And it's something I'd never heard of. And it's also a good reminder that teamwork makes the dream work, or at least it makes survival more likely. Getting the silver medal with this list is The Martian by Andy Weir. I don't think I've talked about this book on my channel before, mostly because it's so well known, but I love it, and it's my second favorite survival story of all time. In it, astronaut Mark Watney finds himself stranded on Mars with nothing but his brain and a few potatoes. That's after a dust storm forces his crew to abandon him, but he doesn't give up. He's bound and determined to science his way into staying alive. And even though this novel is fiction, it feels incredibly real, like a couple of the other ones I've talked about. Using his background as a botanist and engineer, Watney is able to stretch his food, produce water, and even grow crops. And his personality comes off as incredibly genuine too. Weir does an amazing job with this. Watney is beyond resourceful. He's self-deprecating and incredibly relatable as he jerry-rigs solutions to the problems that are constantly popping up, as they will when you're on a planet millions of miles from Earth. It's all extremely entertaining, and you celebrate with each of Mark's victories. You're like 100% invested in his survival. And the end, of course, really isn't totally a foregone conclusion. Before we get to the best survival book I've ever read, let's take a sec to remember the motivational speech Destiny's Child gave us when they sang, "I'm a survivor. I'm not gonna give up. I'm not gonna stop. I'm gonna work harder." Well said, ladies. Well said. Anyway, topping my list at the #1 spot, taking home the gold medal, is 438 Days by Jonathan Franklin. This is the unbelievable true story of Salvador Alvarenga, a guy who set off for a quick fishing trip off Mexico's coast, but ended up adrift at sea when his boat's engine died. For 14 months, Salvador floated 9,000 miles, I think it was, which is like going from New York to Moscow and back. In that time, he caught fish and turtles with his bare hands, collected rainwater, and tried to stay sane. Alvarenga was surviving solo, relying on just his smarts to get food and stay hydrated. The author, Franklin, captures the grit, humor, and creativity that kept this Mexican fisherman going through all kinds of things like storms, sunburns, and even an encounter with curious sharks. This book is about more than a man's will to just live. It's a celebration of strength and hope when everything is stacked against you. It's rare that I find a page-turning nonfiction read, but that's exactly what this was. I was just floored by how Alvarenga lasted as long as he did and the brilliant ways that he made it all possible. Way more people should read this book. So what survival books have you enjoyed? Whether they're nonfiction or not, let me know in the comments. I'm always interested in reading about people who do amazing things that I never could do. And don't forget to like and subscribe as well. Happy reading.